another whistleblower comes forward. Just days before Trump's inauguration, Ross Coulthart reveals another UAP whistleblower on News Nation. Former airman Jake Barber goes public, revealing he worked under non-official cover as part of an elite team of special operators tasked with recovering crashed military aircraft and UFOs. Despite 3 other special operators coming forward to vouch for Jake Barber's claims, skeptics continue to question his story and military record. Dr. John Blitch, a former Green Beret and Special Mission Unit troop commander, joins us to discuss how he came to know Jake Barber and why he believes what Jake and his team have told him about their astounding crash retrieval activities. But is Jake Barber who he says he is? And are his allegations true?
You're goddamn right.
Hi, I'm Matt Ford. Welcome to the Good Trouble Show. We have a very special guest today. Former Green Beret and Special Mission Unit Troop Commander Dr. John Blitch joins us on the Good Trouble Show for a 2-part exclusive interview to discuss UAP whistleblower Jake Barber. But first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons on YouTube. Leave a comment and let us know what you think about this episode. You can also find us on X at Good Trouble Show and everywhere else at The Good Trouble Show. You can also find us wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Search for The Good Trouble Show with Matt Ford. And if you would like to chip in to keep the lights on, you can become a Patreon member of The Good Trouble Show by going to www.patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. Sign up to help us keep bringing you amazing shows like the one we have today. Now, with all of that out of the way, here is part 1 of our interview with Dr. John Blitch. Please welcome Dr. John Blitch. Dr. Blitch, how are you, sir?
I am loving life, man. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Welcome to the Good Trouble Show. Your first time here. Hopefully, this is the first of many appearances that you'll have on our show. We of course have a lot of common friends. I met you through Lou Elizondo, and I have to say we really hit it off. But I actually never asked the story of how you connected with Lou, how you met him. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm a big fan of your show, and thanks for everything you're doing for the disclosure effort.
Thank you.
Yeah. Like many people, I started following Lou after his heroic disclosure effort in late 2017. I was a professor at the Air Force Academy and started following him then. And I ended up being very enthusiastic about his effort. I don't throw that word heroic around easily. I mean, he put it all on the line. So I was very impressed with that. And then kept following him after he ended up at TTSA. But what inspired me to actually track him down, and that's a challenging thing for anybody of his background, right? In the intelligence community. He knows how to disappear pretty well.
Right.
But I was able to track him down because I was very impressed with that TV series that TTSA put together, To the Stars Academy, called Unidentified. Watched every one of those episodes, several of them more than once. But the last episode, season 2, episode 8, which was the only one that covered or had any direct activity with regards to the abduction phenomenon, that kind of upset me. And so I tracked him down and just, did everything I could to put him on the pedestal that he so richly deserves for his selfless service and all the risk that he and his family have taken on behalf of our fellow humans and Americans. And so that's how I tracked him down.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people really have a difficult time wrapping their heads around is the fact that people, these folks that have come forward, such as Lou, such as David Grusch, and of course we have Jake Barber now, this new whistleblower that was on Ross Coulthart's special. These folks are really putting themselves on the line, putting themselves at risk, their families at risk. all to really kind of call out this sort of tragedy of the American government not being straight with the American people about the UAP issue.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. And I think all of those folks would admit that they stand on the shoulder of so many others, many shoulders that are stacked up for the last 80 years or so. Sergeant Major Robert O'Dean, a personal hero of mine, but Kathy Martin, a lot of the researchers, Travis Walton, all these folks coming forward and taking huge risks to their career, to their families, their lives, and my hat is off to all of them.
Absolutely. You have quite an outstanding history of serving this country. If you don't mind, walk us through your military service before you began working in the Special Forces community.
Okay, well, let me see. So I'm class of 1981 from West Point, but do not be impressed. I was a lousy student.
Me
Graduated with a 2.41 GPA, and I set a record for demerits before Christmas, my plebe year. But
Wow.
2.41 GPA. With that background, then they put me in charge of nuclear weapons. Go figure, right?
Go figure.
Yeah. So ended up in Germany, practicing launching nuclear projectiles from West Germany into East Germany. And I got to tell you, I had some misgivings about that. One night in particular, gorgeous blizzard, post-blizzard, full moon comes out, and I started really trying to come to grips with the fact that we were trying to kill people that never hurt me, and in that far distant, right, in East Germany. And then it occurred to me that we're not just killing them, we're killing their kids, their grandkids for decades and centuries to go. So you're reaching not only into another country, but you're reaching into the future with those weapons. So had a difficult time with that. I always really wanted to be an astronaut, so applied, couldn't become an Army aviator, helicopter pilot. So I submitted an inter-service transfer to the Navy, believe it or not, to be Goose, the backseater in Top Gun.
Wow.
And it was approved. I had orders. I was ready to go, but then they were revoked in 1986. And I was stuck at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and was put in charge of a Pershing II missile battery. Now, I want to be very clear about that. It was a battery. It was not a battalion. I've never been a battalion commander. And it's a very significant distinction because a battery is only 120 people, 120 soldiers.
Okay.
A battalion is 500 soldiers, and that's commanded by a lieutenant colonel. So I was only a captain at the time. But it was significant in that I became intimately familiar with the Personnel Reliability Program, which basically prevents crazy people from getting access to nuclear weapons.
Okay.
So I had to sign 6 slips every single morning about whether or not, if this person was prescribed Motrin or acetaminophen or any number of other items, whether or not they were fit for nuclear duties. So it was a real pain in the neck, very tedious, but necessary, obviously. But then I got kind of sick and tired of that. In fact, the day of my outgoing change of command was the day that the INF Treaty was signed. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed on December 10th, 1986, and they did away with all our missiles. So now what am I going to do?
Sure.
I remember going to a classified briefing about this hush-hush rumored hostage rescue organization, and we all had to show our credentials and be listed. It was only at a secret level, and they were recruiting, and so I signed up, but they turned me down. They said, well, you need to go into regular special forces first and then maybe reapply from there. So that's how I ended up in SF.
Got it. Okay. And I want to talk now, really dig into this, to the Special Forces. I recently referred to you as a Delta Force commander, and it turns out I was actually completely wrong. So first, I'd like to apologize for that. And I would love for you to correct what I said on the record. My understanding of the Special Forces community is obviously a little bit lacking. So why was I wrong in how I referred to you? Well, please educate me.
Well, don't worry about it, Matt. There's no reason to apologize. It actually is factual and accurate. I think I sent you a military document that says that I was assigned to that unit with that name. But none of us like that. Well, I shouldn't speak for everybody. I was only there for 3.5 years. But the vast majority of us abhor that name because it has this Hollywood flavor to it with Chuck Norris, one of my childhood heroes, growing up learning karate and all that stuff. And, books by that name and so forth. And we really don't like to have that limelight on us. We much prefer to operate behind the scenes. And it's really an operational necessity if you think about it, because if every time we go rescue American hostages in a foreign country, we beat our chests and say, America to the rescue, well, they're not going to invite us back. It's much more important for us to give the local country credit for that and keep our identity secret. And then everybody wins, right? We get our American citizens back. They get credit for handling their own crisis, and everybody wins. And we do the same thing with some of our conventional military units as well. We'll give them credit, and many times they deserve the vast majority of it. So it's a real important aspect to sort of suppress ourselves. And the other thing that is probably the most important of all is it keeps our egos under check, right? I mean, our hot washes used to be brutal. The after action, we are absolutely our worst critics, and so we're brutal within ourselves, and that's a really important aspect because you can't ever afford to think that you're a badass and that you're king of the pile. There's always somebody bigger, better, stronger, tougher. And so it's a very important aspect of that. So we typically refer to it as the unit. And then, of course, there was a TV show about the unit. So, we should have probably started referring to it as something else. Maybe the current guys do refer to it as something else, but that's what I refer to it. And again, I got to caveat all this, Matt. My time back there was I left there in 1993. So we're, 30, 40 years? So it was a long time ago. And a lot of my, background there is dated. So I really don't like to talk about that unit or any of that stuff because there's so many more people with way more experience than me, guys that have spent their entire life there and done truly heroic stuff. So I never did anything even remotely heroic in the slightest way. I kept my head on one time during one real world deployment. That's about it. So that's kind of that aspect of it. So we like to use the term, the technical term, Special Mission Unit. That's all we were, or a SMU. And so that's what I will acknowledge, that I was a true commander and a SMU, not the Delta Force commander like you call me. Okay, which is no big deal.
Got it.
But realize, again, that is a full colonel. That's an 06. I was an 03. I wasn't even middle management. I was lower middle management.
Got it. So what sorts of things, just in a general way, special forces, not even specifically talking about the unit or your unit, but in a general way, folks that have no idea who special forces are. A lot of times you hear this term, a tier 1 operator, thrown around, and I think, including myself, a lot of us are not very clear on what that means. Give us like an overview of how that is organized, what are tier 1 operators, and just consider that, assume that I know absolutely nothing, which is pretty close to being accurate, about what sort of thing you guys did.
Well, you're very humble, Matt. I think you know a lot more than you say, but I'm trying to put myself compassionately in your shoes and sort through all the misinformation and other information. It's the nature of the beast right now. So in general, when I went into Special Forces at first and commanded those two A teams, those detachments, our mission was to parachute or insert behind enemy lines, either parachutes or scuba dive or whatever it is, to get in there and then operate behind enemy lines. It was the Cold War. Enemy line was pretty much the Iron Curtain, Soviet Union. I was in 10th group, so we were oriented on Europe. Each Army Special Forces group is geographically oriented. So 5th group's Middle East, 7th group is Central South America, 1st group is Pacific. Everybody has their areas, and we're language trained in those areas. And so that was the general idea. JFK deserves a lot of credit for that because he envisioned this, force multiplier that we would go in with culturally sensitive and language trained folks and organize them to rise up against their own tyrannical authoritarian government. And rather than having our conventional forces invade, have them rise up, and we would do all we can to assist. And so obviously we had a pretty intensive relationship with the intelligence services, right? Because they had to guide us, and a lot of times we would work with them in that role. In terms of the Tier 1 world, that all spun up pretty much in the aftermath of the 72 Munich massacre, where terrorists pretty much wiped out the Israeli Olympic team, track team, I think it was. And we started realizing, wow, this new form of warfare is rising up. And so Charlie Beckwith, who had done a lot of work with the SAS, the UK, the British SAS, Australia has SAS too, very good, very phenomenal, top-level folks. But it's a little bit different mission because now instead of focusing on all this cultural sensitive aspects of things, what you're really trying to do is surgically interdict and make sure that bullet goes this way instead of this way into a hostage. And that's very, very difficult, very time consuming. And I think it's pretty well known now. It wasn't back then, but back at we had a barrel that was full of cartridges, brass cartridges, a 55-gallon barrel. And that represented what one operator would shoot downrange. That's the amount of lead that a single person would put downrange in just 6 months of their initial operator training course, what we call. Wow. That amount of lead downrange at that time was probably equal to what an entire company, like 120 troops, would get. So it was, we had more resources, but more was demanded of us. And so because of that demand, this tier structure was come up with. We don't like it. I don't like it because it has this, superiority flavor to it. We're not superior. It's different missions with different folks. And those of us that have served on both sides of that, not to mention the Ranger Regiment, probably the world's best infantry shock troops that you've ever seen. They have their mission as well. So it's just a different mission. So that's in a nutshell, I guess, my best shot at it from my perspective.
If you were to sort of characterize the people that are in the special operator community, how would you characterize them in terms of, just sort of anything, like personality type, what is important to them, anything of that nature?
Well, I think, this is just my personal opinion. And again, there are a lot of other people with a lot more experience than me. I spent 7 years of my 24 years in command, and 4 of those 5 commands were in special forces. But there are a lot of people with way more time in this. So my perspective is that the single most distinguishing factor for Army Special Forces is not well recognized. And I think it boils down to a single word: maturity. Because the average Army Ranger, the average Navy SEAL, when they come in, they can be pretty much straight up the street. Of course, they go through intensive training, but you're 18, 20 years old, somewhere in that 1 or 2 year time frame. What makes Army Special Forces unique, or at least it did, and then they changed and then they kind of went back. It's a pendulum swing. Was that we would not accept anybody until after they have already served their first tour. So if you're 18, you do 3 years in some other field, and then you can come apply to Special Forces, and then you go through your language training, and then you go through the SFQC, and then by then you're, 22, right? And so you're starting to approach the maturity. So my background in cognitive neuroscience, my PhD was using EEG on folks. So I dabbled. I used to call myself a neuroscientist, and then I realized, dude, that's BS, right? You didn't discover anything in neuro. You just use neuroscientific tools. So anyway, what we know, though, from that community is the human brain does not fully mature until you're 25 as a male, 23 as a female. And so we really get a much more mature force with all that additional training by the time you are awarded your Green Beret and you're wearing that. And then from there, the tier 1 level is usually years beyond that. So we have a much more mature force. Never mind all the physical training and resilience and the cognition. Now, the second part is not well known either, and that is that over decades of analysis, our psychologists, which is a much higher density than the rest of the Army. The rest of the Army, you used to, again, all this data is dated, but back during the Cold War, you might have one psychologist or a counselor assigned to like a brigade, which is 1,500 troops. We would have one per 60. So,
wow.
So think about that. So there's a lot of cognitive assessment that goes on. And what's very important about that is that when they administer their assessments or their surveys or whatever you call it, we're exhausted. The average person that takes an IQ test or takes some sort of psychology test at 10 o'clock in the morning after you've had your donut and coffee, so you can kind of figure out whether or not they want me to answer B or C. There might be one or two fuzzies in there, but you can kind of figure it out, right? At 10 o'clock at night, you're exhausted, you're bruised from falling down, the mountainside. You're going to answer that accurately, right? The way you really feel. And so our psychologists get a much more crisp perspective of what's going on up in here. So that's another advantage when you're dealing with very, very difficult decisions. And I wanted to point out this other aspect because even though I did command a recce troop, a reconnaissance troop, and they were comprised of snipers, I was never a sniper. Yes, I had a long gun and I would train and I would shoot downrange, but I never had to make that decision, Matt, where I'm looking through this scope and there's somebody downrange and I got to decide whether or not to pull the trigger. Now, of course, we get a dossier, but herein lies the problem, and I'm transitioning obviously into the issue with Jake and his team, is the morality of that, right? The ethics.
Sure.
Because we're presented with this dossier, sometimes fairly thick dossier, and that's provided by the intelligence community saying that this guy, or in very rare cases, this gal, is a bad person, and deadly force is warranted to eliminate them, take them off the battlefield. So if we're surveying, if we're performing reconnaissance, and we see this person slapping their wife around or beating their kids or wherever it is, okay, then I've observed it, and if I'm close enough to hear it and hear what's going on, again, with our language skills, and even smell, those are really critical components of making that decision. So those folks that have to make that decision have a really difficult time. So what really is problematic now, as technology removes us and gets us further and further away, now we can't hear him. Now we can't smell him. Now we can't see him. Now well, you could see him, but on a predator feed, black and white predator feed, you're just going based on the intelligence that you've received. So it makes it a very difficult challenge. So I was never a sniper. I was a recce troop commander, and the snipers, the really tough guys with the skill and the really difficult PTSD creating decisions. Those were other folks.
And when you say recce troop, you mean reconnaissance troop?
Yes, I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. And again, my heart goes out to you, brother, because you folks in the media, you're like I was when I went to the Air Force Academy. I'm an Army nug.
Sure.
I just finally figured out all the acronyms that the Army uses. And now I'm in acronym hell. And what's worse, it's kind of like learning Russian, right? Because there's enough letters in the Russian Cyrillic alphabet there that are the same letter. Like C in Russian is an S. And so it's just, send me to learn Mandarin. So everything's new. So this acronym hell that you're in, I sympathize with you.
Yeah, I can't imagine. So in terms of Special Forces Tier 1 operators, what sort of security clearance would you hold in those positions?
Yeah, so wide disparity there, depending on what your background was. So we had folks that literally would try out. They were members of the band. We had a tuba player come through A&S. We had a cook. Matter of fact, I love the guy, and he was a phenomenal sniper, by the way. Mm-hmm. Tremendous shot, and he got the code name T-Bone, right?
Code name what?
So T-Bone for steak, right? For cutting steak.
Sure.
And he was brilliant. What a great guy. So there's a lot of that jocularity, obviously, that comes with. They should find the same thing in firehouses and on the police force and so forth. But, the key aspect of that is we all have very different, I shouldn't say very different. The vast majority of folks, that come from the Ranger Regiment, come from infantry backgrounds. Every now and then you'll get somebody from kind of a way out area like nuclear weapons. I think I'm probably one of the only guys that ever commanded a nuclear capable unit that ended up there at the unit. It's just so anomalous, right? So I happen to have SITK stuff, all this access that other folks didn't have. But on a case by case basis, if it's needed for a particular operation, they'll do an SSBI, a sensitive secret background investigation, and they'll up your clearance as needed. And I think I danced around that a little bit, but hopefully that.
No, that's okay. And in most cases, to maintain that clearance, is there a polygraph involved?
Yeah, I don't want to get into that. That gets kind of sensitive.
Got it.
Now, I may just be dated because back during the Cold War, even mentioning that you had a polygraph, that was kind of sensitive stuff. So I would rather not dive into that.
So can I ask you what your code name or a nickname was?
Matt, I would get a new one just about every month because I was such a screw up, right? These guys barely tolerated me. So my final one was Tadpole. And that was a derivative from, because I was originally a bulldog because I was so stubborn. I mean, look at that frontal slope. That screams Neanderthal, right? Right. So I was stubborn. And so they're like, he's like a bulldog. He won't let it go, And then somebody decided, well, that's a little bit too macho, so we'll start calling him Bullfrog. But then there was this tanning lotion that came out, and it had this big muscle-bound guy on the beach, right? And I'm like, well, we can't call him that. So then so they had to knock me down another peg to Tadpole. And in one of my troops, we had a great sort of tradition that nobody could have a macho code name. And it really made sense tactically, right? Because if, we're called on the carpet at some point down the line and we got to testify in front of Congress and there's radio transcripts and somebody says that, Bubbles and Porky butt stroked somebody in the head and it turned out that it wasn't a bad guy, it was a good guy, then it kind of brings a little bit of levity to the whole situation, right? So I thought it was a brilliant tradition. So yeah, I had tons of them.
I would imagine that there's a lot of camaraderie in the special operator community, both during active duty and I would imagine a post-active duty.
Yes, absolutely. There's something about shared risk. In my robotics book, I talk about risk a lot as a form of love. Matter of fact, I think it's the definition of love. When you accept risk on behalf of somebody else, that is a form of love. Now, paternal risk, if you're a mom and you end up, this is going to sound crass, I hope maybe you can edit this out, but if you have spit a bowling ball out of your crotch after 9 months, right, of morning sickness, and then that thing's hanging off of your tad, sucking the life out of you. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, a couple of centuries ago, you were literally risking your life to bring that child into the world. So, and then you have fraternal love, where you have siblings that will fight like brothers. You're at each other's throats, but if somebody else challenges your brother, you're at him. Right. And so you're going to accept that risk. And even in a professional sense, right, that, you're working for some company and then you see somebody else that is unfairly treated and you step in and you take the blame. Again, risk is love. So the longer that risk is shared and the more intense the conditions under which that risk is shared, that bond gets tighter. And there's a lot of literature, war literature on this side is the war literature. This side is the UFO literature.
Sure.
There's a lot of those that military literature that talks about how the bond between foxhole buddies is tighter than you get in marriage, and a lot of that is due to that heightened level of risk. So yeah, camaraderie is huge, and I think a lot of the reason why so many of our brothers and sisters end up, tempted by suicide is because they miss that camaraderie so much. It's so important as a source of resilience. So yeah, that was key that you brought that up. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. And I would imagine that all of you tend to have pretty high expectations of each other to live up to to the job you did and what you did in serving the country. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I already mentioned how brutal our hot washes were, but that's across the military, not just the places I was assigned. And you see some of this. That's why this whole stolen valor movement is really getting very intensive, because it's tempting when you have been underpaid for the risk that you have taken. Look, taxpayer dollars not only paid for my bachelor's degree, but 2 master's degrees and a PhD. I was overpaid probably for the risks I took, but some of the other guys, like the snipers I talked about, the assaulters, they're underpaid for the level of risk. So it's tempting to kind of embellish a little bit and maybe sell a few more books than the bland story would do. So my heart goes out to those guys, but there's still heroes, regardless of there's inaccuracies, and maybe they took a little bit more credit than they don't. And I'm certainly not going to get into any of that, especially since I wasn't there for most of that stuff. So yeah, it's a big deal.
Now, tell us a bit about your post-military career. You worked at DARPA, and you have quite a background in robotics. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so after those 5 command tours, I was kind of a burned out commando, and the personnel center folks at the Pentagon basically told me after I came out of the Command General Staff College, that's kind of a ticket punch on the way to becoming a general. It's a selected school, so not everybody gets to go. So it's a big hurdle, if you will. And when I was there, learning how to become a staff officer for a general in the hopes that maybe I would become a general someday. Figure that, right? They told me that I was a burned out commando and that I needed to take a break. I really wanted to go right back to the unit. Once you get a taste of that, there is no higher level job satisfaction than literally being a phone call away. The President of the United States says, okay, and it trickles down through the real Delta Force commander, by the way, that trickles down to you. And the next thing you know, you're on a plane within a few hours, headed to God knows where to solve some problem, right? That level of job satisfaction just doesn't exist anywhere else that I know. So I was really excited to get back, but my wife was obviously not. She was absolutely sick of it all, hated it all, and wanted to be a civilian. So we ended up, by the grace of the big cheese upstairs and some folks at the Pentagon who were fooled by some silly IQ test somewhere, that they thought that I would be a good candidate to go to graduate school. So you and your taxpayer dollars paid for me to go get a master's degree at the Colorado School of Mines. So thank you for that. So I ended up going out there to study robotics and artificial intelligence. And that wasn't, I ended up getting into rescue robotics, but it wasn't quite as honorable as you might think. I wanted to be an astronaut. I always wanted to be an astronaut. I figured, well, geez, if I go study robots, and this is mid-90s, right? Pathfinder, we're putting rovers on Mars. I'm like, well, I'm not a pilot. I didn't, I had my orders revoked to go to the Navy to be a jet jockey. So maybe if I'm a robot geek, maybe NASA might be interested in that. And since we're going to be wandering around on the moon, not on the moon, on Mars, you're going to need somebody that knows how to navigate on the land. Now, look, I did some of the first testing of GPS, portable GPSs for the DoD. Wow. And I'm convinced it was only because I was lost more than anybody else. So they're like, hey, we give this guy the gizmo and he makes it onto the beach and back up to his objective. Yeah, maybe there's something to it. So that's what I originally went to grad school to study. And that took a serious right-hand turn after Timothy McVeigh blew up the Murrah building on April 19th, 1995. Because I ended up volunteering to go there. I had taken my flight aptitude test to become the Navy fighter jock in that building. Some of the people I knew almost exactly 10 years ago, 10 years prior. So I ended up down there and just helping, pull part of the bucket brigade. You probably saw this at the World Trade Center as well.
Sure.
There's buckets. You're just daintily picking apart the rubble because there still could be people in there. It's a very tedious, but it's also a very surgical process. And the problem in both those instances, it was a crime scene. It was considered more of a crime scene during the Oklahoma City bombing, of course. And so only people with security clearances could become volunteers. Everybody else was held outside the perimeter. It's really unfortunate. So anyway, I came back from that, and I was very emotionally affected by that, and I decided to dive into rescue robotics. There really wasn't a field at that point, and so that's where I went, and that's how I got into robot world.
And this was at DARPA?
That was at the Colorado School of Mines. So here's the thing.
Okay.
Is I'm a military student, so I have to justify the military funding. And, it's not the military's job to go rescue people after a collapsed building. That's the fire, right? So I had to find a threefer, not just a twofer, a threefer, because I wanted to be an astronaut. So I had to figure an angle on that. And it turned out that Dan Golden had just taken over as the NASA administrator with smaller, better, cheaper. So little robots, right? Because I think at that time it was $3,000 per ounce to put something into orbit. And so the smaller little guys, bigger. So I'm like, yeah, little robots good for that. Little robots are also good for sneaking up underneath barbed wire and sneaking their way into an objective as part of our reconnaissance effort. And then it turned out from Oklahoma City, the big takeaway there was, these trapped victims, it's a horrific decision for an incident commander to have to make the decision to transition from a rescue effort into a recovery effort. And what that means is we're going to bring in the big cranes and bulldozers and start removing big chunks of debris. And there's a big problem with that, right? Because if somebody's still trapped on it, you may squash it in the process of trying to rescue him. So it's a really challenging effort. And so I came away with the niche there of slipping down into that rubble and, with a tether towing an air hose or a water hose or a microphone so you can talk to the victims and tell everybody, whoa, hang on. There's still somebody alive down here, right? And that turned out to be beneficial enough for the DOD to kind of really get excited about it. So Special Operations Command got excited about it because it allowed us to look for WMD in places where people were hiding them. So US SOCOM got excited about it. And then DARPA got excited about it as sort of maybe the potential for future technology development. So that's how, after a couple of years at SOCOM, with a fabulous boss, his name was Doug Brown. He was a one-star general at that time, but he ended up rising through the ranks as he should have and became a four-star general. So from there, I ended up at DARPA. That's how I got to DARPA.
Got it. Okay, so Dr. Blitch, before we get into the whole Jake Barber thing, which is why we're primarily here, I have to ask, when you were active duty, were you, number one, did you ever see any UAP, especially being part of a nuclear intermediate range system? No UAPs or anything there?
Let me see. I've had some interesting experiences throughout my lifetime, but I just to be clear, I was in uniform when I was at DARPA. I was a lieutenant colonel at DARPA as a program manager, and I retired out of DARPA. And interestingly enough, and that this is the source of a lot of conspiracy stuff. There are guys that claim that I was I was trying to cover up evidence at Oklahoma City because I was a crazy Special Forces major. What's a Special Forces major doing mixed in with all these firefighters? And the truth is crazier than it seems, that I had taken an inter-service transfer, flight aptitude test there, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I was on active duty at DARPA. I retired out of DARPA, and I signed out from the Pentagon on the 10th of September, 2001.
Got it. And as in terms of like your work in the government, were you ever part of any UAP related program?
No.
Okay.
Now I was read in on a number of SAPs, special access programs. There's operational SAPs, then there's technological SAPs. An operational SAP is obviously intended to protect that operation. And then when the operation is wrapped up and done, that doesn't mean you stop protecting it, because it might involve assets or people that are still undercover. Technological SAPs tend to last longer, right? Because look at the 117, the F-117, right? That stuff was developed back in the 70s. And we used it in the Gulf War 20 years later with wonderful effect. Arguably, we reduced that from a 2 or 3 year war to 100 days. Yeah. And that technology played no small role. So there are technological SAPs, there are operational SNAPs. Neither of those, any of those that I was read into, had anything to do with UAP that I know of.
Okay, let's jump into the heart of the matter. Whistleblower Jake Barber. This is you on News Nation with journalist Ross Coulthart. Let's watch.
And one of his most fervent supporters is Colonel John Blitch, a Renaissance warrior who holds a doctorate in psychology, was a Delta Force sniper, and is one of the few men to hold doomsday in his hands, commanding a nuclear weapons battalion.
So you believe Jake Barber is telling the truth?
Absolutely.
There has been a cover-up lasting 80 years.
Absolutely.
We've recovered craft.
Absolutely.
That was fantastic. So how did you get involved in the entire Jake Barber story?
So actually Dave Grusch reached out to me. Grusch. I mean, we used to call him Dave Grusch. Now folks call him Dave Grusch. He's like, call me whatever. He's such an approachable guy. He's a wonderful man. And again, a hero by any standard in my mind. But Dave was struggling, obviously, after all the folks that came after him, and he suffered horribly after that. But again, even post PTSD, right? So like a P3 PTSD, right? He wanted to encourage others to come out, not just to benefit him, right? It helped him because a lot of the criticism against him was, hey, look, you didn't see a craft, you didn't see an alien, how can you be claiming this, right? And so, it's just the classic narrow-minded people that can't embrace other information outside their narrow, soda straw. So Dave reached out to me and said he knew some other folks who did have firsthand knowledge, but they were very worried because of the backlash that could be taken against them. And so he told them that, he knew a guy. Well, he told me that they just needed a little bit of leadership. They needed to hear some of your stories and convince them that it's going to be okay, and that the alternative is way worse. And we see this all the time where people keep things buttoned up for years, and then on their deathbed, they come clean, and it's a sort of a horrific thing. So he asked me to meet with these guys because at least one of them was a tier 1 operator. Now, I want to be very clear here. Jake Barber never told me he was a tier 1 operator. He never claimed to be a active CCT operator. He did claim and showed me documentation that he went through the pre-training to go through the CCT pipeline.
And what is CCT?
CCT is combat controller. It's the Air Force rough equivalent of a Green Beret who goes, they wear a different color beret, whatever. But none of us wear it into the woods. And all those pictures of people in berets, it's laughable. Because it's not a very functional headgear. Right?
Sure.
It doesn't even keep the rain off you, for crying out loud.
Right.
Boonie hats are way better than that. Keep the rain from falling down your neck. So
Sure.
That's a running joke. But anyway, so they would parachute behind enemy lines, and they would essentially be air traffic controllers, right? So if you have 5 or even anything more than 1 aircraft orbiting over an area to support troops on the ground, you kind of need somebody independent of those 2 aircraft to tell which one to turn right, which one to turn left. Of course, they're going to do the best they can to deconflict, but it's especially difficult when you have a fast mover. Think Maverick coming in with a C-130 with paratroopers coming out. It gets to be complicated. And then you add a 3rd aircraft and a 4th aircraft. Think of the multi-body problem, right, from astronomy, the 3-body problem, right? So it gets really complicated. So those guys are air traffic controllers who also double as, marksmen and scuba qualified, Halo qualified guys to do pretty much anything that we did, variants. It's like I said before, nobody's better than the others, just different jobs. So that's what a CCT does. And then you have PJs, pararescue jumpers, who focus on their medics, and they focus on patching together a downed pilot and stabilizing that patient until they can be medevaced. So those are, and then there's some JTACs who are focused on calling in not artillery fire. I'm familiar with that. I used to call in close air as well, but things changed. You got more sophisticated, and you really need somebody that is familiar with the type of ordnance and how to place that ordnance to guide the aircraft so that they don't shoot from us. So those are the 3 primary specialties within the Air Force ground pounder special tactics world. There are also weathermen, which are very, very important. As we know from the Eagle Claw, the 1979 issue where we went into Iran to try to pull the hostages out, et cetera. Weather played a big part in that with the dust storm, the Haboobs, that really pretty much devastated that aerial insertion mission.
Okay, so David Grusch reaches out to you and says, I've got whistleblowers with firsthand knowledge in terms of UAP crash retrieval, et cetera. Did he indicate that any of these whistleblowers were hesitant to come forward due to what they saw had happened to Dave himself?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. That was a prominent factor.
That was.
They were very worried about that.
So what did you do to allay their fears?
Well, the main, these are courageous people by nature. So it wasn't like I had to inject any courage in them. What I wanted to do was to inspire them and just give them a friendly ear. You're not crazy. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of us who have had these anomalous experiences, and we are on the verge of being dragged kicking and screaming, and I'll say it, into a galactic society out there. And so I think he just wanted them to have an open ear that wasn't just judgmental and dismissive. And so when I told, this is part of what I call corrosive leadership that is behind this 80-year cover-up.
Tell us about that.
It is corrosive. When you compartment and you tell this person you can't talk to this person, even though they're on the same doggone team, that breaks down the cohesion that our military depends upon. And the Air Force being the youngest service, prior to the Space Force, and Space Force is a derivative of the Air Force. They're really still under the Secretary of the Air Force, the Department of the Air Force. This compartmentation is absolutely inherently corrosive. And so when someone comes to me, if one of my troops came to me and reported an anomalous activity out on an OP, an observation post, and every time they did that, I berated them and treated them like they were a criminal and separated them and interrogated them and tortured them in some cases, like Terry Lovelace has, like Mario Woods has, a number, John Burroughs. A lot of these guys were treated horribly, as if they were the terrorists. So how does that affect our military? It breaks apart our cohesion. We need to be sympathetic and compassionate. And let's not even talk about all of the millions of civilian experiences in this.
Right.
So within this element, especially since they were all a cohesive team, all four of them, and two of them were verified Tier 1 operators. I have the validation of them. Neither Jake nor Don Paul claimed that they were Tier 1 operators. They and that's up for them to deal with. But Fred most definitely was. And so Dave wanted them to hear from somebody at, I guess, a little bit higher rank. Again, I'm middle management. I'm not a flag officer, but a field grade officer is high enough up in the realm to be actionable. To punish someone or to intervene in that punishment. And so Dave felt that I might be able to nudge them into coming forward.
So tell us about when you first met them. You told me this story, and I think it is just absolutely fabulous. This is like straight out of a Bond movie. So Dave has you get in touch with these guys. Tell us about when you met them in person.
Well, I would think it's more like Spies Are Us with Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase, but
that's a great movie.
So it was a fascinating experience because they wanted to meet someplace neutral because they didn't know if I was, part of the military-industrial complex that was going to take them out, right? And Dave told him that I was a Tier 1 guy. And again, I hate that terminology, but it is what it is. It's out there, so I'll use it. So they were nervous about me. And I was a little bit nervous about them because Dave gave me them a little bit of background on them, and they were worried, that we might have some friendly, unfriendly, interdiction, if you will, or lethal force harm. So the original plan was that Dave, who's a big guy himself, I mean, I would not want to meet up with Dave Grusch and see him angry in an alleyway.
Yeah.
Same thing with Ross Coulthart, right? Black belt. He's got martial arts training. He and I both idolize Chuck Norris, and they're both really big guys, right? And so I'm this stubby little Neanderthal. What am I going to do? I might pick up a boulder and throw it at him. So the plan was that we were all going to meet out on the West Coast and meet aboard my sailboat and go for a sail. And so I figured, well, if I got Dave and Ross on my side, 3 against 4, yeah, it might get a little bloody, but we could probably handle it. So it just turned out that the congressional, meetings were all spinning up in D.C. So Ross has to stay there an extra day. And Dave is still worried because he's getting threats. He ain't going to D.C. So I end up, me alone, meeting these 4 big dudes. And 2 of them are MMA champions. And so I'm getting a little nervous, right? And so I pick a place, and it was a little warming up type of situation, tradecraft. You do this public place, I go through the procedure of observing them from afar for a while, and so then we approach, and I got to tell you, the mannerisms, the cohesion, it felt like I was right back on one of my teams. I mean, we instantly gelled, but I still had my guard up, and I wanted to be careful. And so the big breakthrough was that I felt comfortable enough to bring him, into Marine onto the boat. But before we left the harbor, and they slit my throat and dumped me overboard for the sharks, right, and sail my boat off somewhere and scuttle it, right?
Right.
I wanted to, do a little bona fide. So basically what I told him is, hey, look, one of the things that I think is lacking in the leadership that you guys have been under is that leaders pull, managers push. And so as a leader, I'm going to take the risk first. So I laid out 3 forms of identification. I showed him my passport, I showed him my driver's license, and I showed him my military ID. Now, any one of those you might be able to fake, but all 3 of them, that's kind of difficult. And what I was looking for was hesitation. And I was looking primarily for them to look at each other like, oh, crap, now we're screwed.
Right.
And I got to tell you, man, I was ready to dive off that boat. I thought they were going to, wrestle me, take me down below, sail away, whatever.
Right.
And they were thinking the same thing about me, right? And so it was a really interesting standoff. But as soon there was no hesitation, everybody, and several of them, a couple of them pulled out 2 forms of identification, kind of to match me. And so that's when all the chill, everything thawed, and we went out and had a great chat. We wanted to be, in a safe environment that we could share our stories without any chance of being recorded. Don Ball turned out, he was carrying a sidearm, and I think his job was probably to take me out behind the ear, and he was kind of shadowing me the whole time while I was driving a boat. He's very inquisitive. He's a really sharp guy. They're all very, very smart, and he was curious about, the display, the chart plotter, and all the rest of this stuff, and how to do this and how to do that. And in the back of my mind, by this time, I was only about a 5% worried, but I'm thinking, why is he so interested? Is he the guy that's going to sail the boat back after they dump me overboard, right?
Right,
so
yeah. He's looking for a training lesson there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was hilarious. And then things settled down, and we had a couple of beers, and everything relaxed, and then it was on.
That's fantastic. So when Jake is telling you his story, what was going through your mind as he's telling this to you?
Well, I always look for, and I used to teach my cadets to look for inconsistencies, right? This generation of cadets, especially Air Force cadets, are really in a difficult position, right? Because with the magic of the internet, you have all this information, and you got to sort out information versus disinformation, and you got to go through the A1 source and information to the F6 or whatever. Very, very difficult. And so I was looking for inconsistencies across all of them. Didn't find them. Didn't find any inconsistencies. Everything would track. Now, of course, one of the things that was an anomaly to me is, wait a minute, why would the Air Force spend all this money to put this guy through pre-CCT training? I mean, that's 4 months. That's an investment.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, why would you do that and then not send him to CCT school? Right? That's kind of weird. And then why give him such a sort of unrelated job as an aircraft mechanic? And so all of this is in a lot of the scuttlebutt that you send me. I try to ignore it. I've been coached about this for quite a while. Lou coached me on this. Dave coached me on it. Look, just you got to ignore the naysayers and the ridiculous skeptics. Now, there's a difference between healthy skepticism, scientific skepticism, which should not only be tolerated, it should be embraced and address it. But some of this is just classic ignorance. Like, where's the dust? There's no dust below the helicopter. Dude, the helicopter's 150 feet above ground. They're out of ground effect. And the vast majority of that desert floor is scrub. It doesn't move. I've slept on that surface. It's like hard as a rock. And so there's no dust. Come on, dude. You're just showing your ignorance. That's all that is. So here's the thing, is he claimed to go knock, non-official cover. And if he was groomed for that, do you think they would have left a paper trail of everything that so I've talked to Jake at length about this, and since that program aired, and as soon as he said the word, I was like, yes, that captures it. Sheep dipped, right? And so you sheep dip someone, you give them the training to get the credibility, and so that they have the right skills, so that when they leave the military, you can use them in what you want to use them for, which obviously was this sort of work. And so, yeah, they sent him to scuba school. Yeah, they sent him to jump school. Yeah, Don Paul never claimed he was a Green Beret. He never, but they went through some of this training so that after they left the military and went into that different line of work that requires deep, deep cover, yeah, that makes sense. And that's what you want the world to believe. You want the world to think that, oh, this guy failed out of CCT training, or he's washed up or whatever, because that's what allows you to do this other work. So all of that, and the documentation, and including the, quote, missing documentation that novices expect should be there, they're just showing that they're not educated. They don't have the experience in the realm. So I didn't find any inconsistencies.
Yeah, because this is the one area that I wanted to bring up, where I think that there are a lot of people. I mean, yes, you've got the debunkers that are clearly out to just spread disinformation and discredit this patriot by any way, shape possible. But what this thing of him being working as a contractor under non-official cover. What do you mean by non-official cover? What is that? Why would you have it? Why would he go under that, or anyone in that particular path?
Well, I want to tread lightly here.
Sure.
And it's not because I'm worried about, somebody throw me in jail or whatever. I think in my Behind the Science interview back in 2014, it's on my LinkedIn page. I talk about this, but I'll try to summarize as well. I've been in trouble all my life. That's not the motivation. The motivation is to protect other people that are still doing this work. So that's why I want to tread lightly. Now, if, as a military person, you are on rolls in the military and you enjoy the protection of the Geneva Convention. Now, a lot of irrational state actors or terrorists don't honor those, right? But it does give you some protection depending on where you're at or whatever. When you're deep undercover and you have credentials that are not your real name, that's a whole different world. And I will tell you from personal experience, it ain't fun. It is, the glorified James Bond, aspect of it. It is a nightmare because you're constantly worried. The stress is off the charts. Because what if you run into somebody in some crazy place that knows you? You're going to lose that friend. John, what? What'd you call me? I don't know who the heck you're talking about, dude. Have a good one. Right? It's one of my classmates from the academy. And you got to tell them, dude, you got the wrong guy. Have a great day. And you just got to dismiss yourself. And so and you're constantly worried about what if I'm recognized, especially nowadays, right? With all this surveillance technology all over the place. Any city in the world, any large city in the world, there's cameras everywhere. So it's terrifically stressful. And so that's why all of those guys have taken extreme risk on behalf of our country. And yet here are people trying to tear them down. I'm not okay with that. It's an enormous risk. And you can imagine why you have to do that, right? Is, if you want to stay ahead of your adversaries, you need to know where their WMD are, right? And so it's a real challenge. So my hat is off to both of those guys, Don Paul and Jake, for the risk they accepted by going non-official cover. And you can see, plenty of there was a Mission Impossible movie it's all about the knock list and how important that is. And it is very, very important.
So, Dr. Blitch, tell us a bit about the other individuals that were on the boat with you, the folks that were in Ross Coulthart's special that vouched for Jake and what his claims were.
Yeah, so having spent some time with them, they again, no inconsistencies across them, and it was clear that they were a cohesive unit. There was a fourth member that I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to mention his name or anything about that, him, because he needs to not come out. But these guys were tight. Their demeanor, their conversation, their body language, everything about them, again, no inconsistencies. Now, look, when I did a very short stint undercover, I wasn't good at it. I just... I could come up with a cover for action, cover for status, but I just wasn't good at it. So these guys would have had to been like A-list actors, I think, to have pulled that off. Maybe, because I didn't see anybody slip in any way, shape, or form. And that was just on the boat. And then we met each other and talked at length afterwards, and it just hit me solid. They're all pretty devout Christians. Most of them are pretty devout Christians, strong family values. I met wives, sons, daughters, hanging out in a very relaxed setting. No inconsistency, no alarm bells. The one alarm bell documentation was that CCT thing. Why would you do this without sending a guy? Well, when I went through scuba school, before the Army would send anybody down to Key West to go through the combat dive course, which is very challenging. I'd say one of the most challenging courses there is, because humans, we don't like to drown. and you are on the edge of drowning in that course, just like buds, right?
Mm-hmm.
SEALs, facing the stuff that they go through, it's horrific. We all fear drowning. That's why waterboarding works. I hate to say it. So anyway, before the United States Army would send soldiers down to this vacation paradise of Key West, they would make sure that they were going to pass. And there were some pretty stupid things that they would do, because if they would figure, say, have this horrific exercise called a crossover where you'd have to hold your breath, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you about that some other time. And after, the average human could do about 4 of these breath holding exercises, very intensive. And so eventually, the rumor was that, well, when you get down there, you got to do 11 or 12. And so the people at Fort Bragg figured, well, if you got to do 12 down there, we're going to make sure that you can do 13 up here, or 14 before we spend the taxpayer dollars to go down there. What they didn't realize is that the schoolhouse had already calculated to minute detail how much the average human can handle. And there was a CCT guy in my pre-scuba class who had a shallow water blackout. He drowned. They hauled him away in an ambulance. And I was in the middle of one of these crossovers, and I'm like, so there's, not to get the details, but if you try to cheat because you just can't hold your breath any longer, and you pop to the surface to sneak a little breath, the instructors, they don't have scuba tanks on. They're very agile. They will jump on your shoulders, just like in water polo, and they will push you to the bottom of the floor. And then you're screwed, because you've missed your opportunity to get a little breath on the other side before you turn back around. So it was like the 14th crossover, and I'm like, I get in, so I try to sneak a breath, and nobody jumps on me. And then I get to the other wall, and I'm looking around, and there's an ambulance, there's sirens, there's red lights, and they're pulling this guy out of the water. And so he had pushed his body beyond the limits, and he had passed out, Matt. It's called a shallow water blackout, and his legs were still thinning. His head was against the side of the pool, and he was doing this. And so the instructors were like, well, he must still be conscious. And then somebody finally realized, oh, crap, and they dove in and saved him. And he ended up going back through, graduating, and I saw him at King Fahd Air Base years later as a CCT guy. It was phenomenal. So that's why you would do that. You would train this guy and make sure that you don't waste a bunch of taxpayer dollars and everybody's time by sending somebody through that very rigorous course of work if they weren't physically up for it. Not to mention you're checking for, injuries or physical incapacitation that the medical exams that the doctors give can't catch. PFOs are a heart defect that really don't show up until your heart is so stressed that this little opening reveals itself between the mesh of your muscle fibers. So those happen as well. And there's no way to screen it until you put that heart under such extreme pressure. And this is how people die, on the side of Mount Everest or, scuba diving, without any indicator. They're super healthy athletes, and boom. So there's a lot to it. So that explains why, in my mind, So I didn't have a big issue with it.
Dr. Blitch, what I would love for you to do is walk us through Jake Barber's story in terms of like where he started militarily, where he ended up, especially with going under non-official cover, and then his claims, or just moreover, like, do you support his claims? So if you would just walk us through all of that.
Well, first of all, I've got to be very clear. Let me do this. And I hate it when academics, and I are one, right, for at least for a while, answer a question with a question. But I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay, please.
Okay. Where were you born and when were you born? And now let me interrupt that question so that you don't have to give personally identifiable information on TV. I draw a big distinction between what I believe and what I know. I used to think that I knew that I was born on March 18, 1959 in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Why? Because I was constantly told that by my parents. And I've seen birth certificates, blah, blah, blah. But do I really know that? Could that all have been a conspiracy when maybe I was born in I don't know, Siberia, and then so my memory doesn't go back that far. So I can't really know that unless I have some corroborating evidence, independent sourced later on. So I want to make that distinction with regard to Jake. I was never assigned with Jake. I was, we might have been, no, I was gone. I was off to CGSC. I was in grad school when he got to Pope Air Force Base in Fort Bragg or in that vicinity. So I was never co-located with him, never assigned with him. And same thing with Don Paul and Fred. So that's not what I was asked to do. I was asked to show a little bit of leadership and compassion and to just be a good listener. And that's what I did. So I'm not Jake Barber's lawyer. I'm not his, I'm not the guy to verify everything on his military records or not. What I can tell you is it is consistent with my awareness of how intelligence agencies across, let's be clear, there's a lot of them now. It's not just the CIA. There's a lot of intelligence agencies. So I don't know, and he hasn't said which one that recruited him or whatever, but the way that he talks about his whole military process is consistent with the way I would run it. If I was recruiting folks, I would want to sheep dip them, get them the training they need, right? Using somebody else's dollars, by the way, the DOD's dollars, right? And then make sure they got that training and then pluck them into arguably a higher role to do what needs to be done under deep cover. So I have no issues with the inconsistencies at all.
Yeah, because I want to read a few things of what some folks said. This is Tim McMillan, who is at the debrief and kind of surprised by what he wrote. Quote, "Is it confirmed that Jacob Barber was in fact a combat controller? The documents shared by News Nation show he enlisted with a CCT pipeline option, but the DD-214 shows him being in aerospace maintenance for the entirety of his enlistment." And let's see, McMillan goes on to say, not saying he wasn't a CCT, but it wasn't confirmed by what was shown. Also, the NATO confidential clearances is from travel documents to Bosnia. That means nothing. Everyone would have it traveling on a NATO mission. And this gentleman, Travis Fields, replies to his tweet, to McMillan's tweet, quote, "Don't see proof he was a combat controller here either. Also, back in my day, you became an E4 senior airman on day 1 of year 4, and he served 6. So I wonder if he should have made staff sergeant. I know a combat controller who I'll ask about this if no one else figures it out." And Tim McMillan replies, quote, "I thought this was odd as well. All Army SOF soldiers are automatically promoted to E5 upon completion of Q course. However, not familiar if it's the same for the Air Force." Your reaction to that?
Well, so the last comment I don't think was targeted towards Jake, is probably towards Don Paul. Don Paul served in the Air Force and the Army. And I think because he was referred to as Special Forces, that's an Army term. The Air Force doesn't use the term Special Forces. They say commandos, special tactics squadrons are typically assigned to those So that's more of an Army term. So I suspect, I don't know Tim. I respect him, as a fellow human, and sounds like probably a pretty talented guy. But there may be just a little bit of naivete there. So Don Paul never claimed to be a Green Beret. And so, again, I sympathize with you and Ross and the media with, just trying to deal with these acronyms and these subtle little nuances on verbiage. But I think that's what that last comment was towards. And so what Jake and Don Paul both have in common is detailed, extensive training with MMA. And so how many air mechanics are MMA champions behind the scenes?
Yeah.
So if you're going to be on the president's helicopter, or you're going to be on a 4-star general's helicopter, they might want a guy that, he can fix the airplane, but he also can take out, a threat as well. So you'll train him in marksmanship. You'll train him in all these other aspects of things. And so that's the sheep dipping. So I guess my answer to all that is sheep dip. Wouldn't you do the same thing?
Yeah.
If you were in charge of security for high-ranking folks, it just makes sense to me.
Yeah, and another person asked, again, just kind of building on what I think Tim McMillan was inquiring about, quote, the claim was made that he was a CCT and PJ. When did that occur? His DD-214 displayed in the 1-hour segment does not support the claim. Is there supporting facts or documents to support the claim?
Again, without going through the nitty-gritty of each and every aspect, I think, we were all thrown in the same pot to a certain extent. Fred unquestionably is a PJ. I've seen his DD-214. He's got 3 Bronze Stars. And so, when you have all of us around that fire pit and picking out, nitnoid aspects of things, I just think that's a little bit ridiculous to go to that level of scrutiny. Again, that doesn't seem to me to be scientific scrutiny. If you don't understand the rationale, okay, let's talk about it, and let's take a list of unresolved issues that we can deal with scientifically, and get a big, brilliant scientist like Gary Nolan involved in this, right? Or very experienced intelligence operatives and managers like Lou Elizondo, Carl Nell, Jay Stratton and Dave Grusch. Get those guys dressed in those. But this is who shot John sort of baloney in my mind. I don't mean to demean anybody.
Sure.
We need to be skeptical. It needs to go through that level. But I don't have any issue with that. That was explained by the pre-scuba, pre-pipeline training, right? He clearly was recruited. He clearly went through a training. He showed that certificate of training that going through that pre-pipeline. He never claimed to be CCT. And so it's a non-issue for me.
And really the takeaway from what I'm hearing you say is the career path that Jake Barber stated is as fact completely comports with other members or other people that you've worked with or encountered during your time in the military. They followed almost the exact same kind of path to move into a non-official cover.
I won't say that. I'm not going to claim that. What I'm going to say again is that there's no. It's consistent.
It is consistent.
It's consistent with the way that an intelligence community would want to bring somebody into a NOC position. You want it mundane. You want it. There's nothing special here, until they assume their other effort, right? I mean, you would love the plumber to be a martial artist, right? Because that's the way it's going to be.
Sure.
And so this path for both Jake and Don Paul along with some law enforcement credentials, which are also makes all the sense in the world, right? So it's all part of this sheep dipping process to get the right skill set for when they leave the military and go into this very challenging field.
Folks, if you enjoyed part 1 of our interview with Dr. John Blitch and want to know more about whistleblower Jake Barber and UFOs, otherwise known as UAPs, you will enjoy this episode with national security expert Matthew Pines. And don't forget to hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons.